Recent years have seen the emergence of a new institutional landscape on sustainable development in the mining sector. Has it delivered its intended results? We ask Tom Butler, CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals. Tom, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thank you, Mark. I think there are some good examples of how some of these initiatives have contributed to better behaviour by companies and by the industry. So, for example, a lot more investors paying attention to what we call ESG, environmental, social and governance indices, and those indices are prepared using some of these initiatives as inputs. So on the company side, it's encouraged better behaviour, and that's largely investor driven. In terms of results on the ground, very variable, some very good examples of good progress, and some countries where there's still some way to go.
Is there an absolute threshold that companies need to achieve in order to deliver impact on the ground?
I think it's very difficult to talk about a sort of binary go, no go. I think it's relative, and I think one of the issues that we face is that societal expectations are continually evolving. So where we started off 15 years ago is not where society is today.
Turning to the ICMM, you represent members that, due to size, history and aspirations, have actively made a point of embracing the Sustainable Development Agenda. However, when you look at sustainable development performance across the industry, there are evident differences in results. How can good performance be better homogenised across the industry?
We try to do two things. We essentially self-regulate amongst the members and set standards for the membership, but we hope that by setting those standards, the rest of the industry will follow. In fact, there are many companies that are not members who comply with our Sustainable Development Framework, and you read their annual report and they're talking about ICMM, so that's good to see. I think the second way this will be solved is by what I call following the money. So, for example, there's increasing pressure on end users who are using metals and minerals to make sure that in their supply chain there are no human rights issues, for example. And I think that's got the attention of the industry, and people are thinking much harder about supply chains. And then finally, I think it's up to host country governments. As I said earlier, the governments also need to play their role, particularly in terms of environmental legislation and also protecting human rights.
In terms of the sustainable agenda going forward, what are the priorities for industry and for the ICMM more generally?
The top priority for us is going to be focusing on partnership, which, by the way, I think is the most important of the SDGs, SDG 17. I think it's critical that we encourage the maximum possible dialogue between all stakeholders to develop a common vision. At the thematic level, there will be a number of priorities which I think are common to both ICMM and the industry. First of all, how to manage water. We've put out a water position statement on that, and we'll be focusing on helping companies implement that. Secondly, on supply chain issues and helping develop clarity around the supply chain, and in particular around human rights issues. And then thirdly, of course, climate change and playing our role, firstly in terms of delivering the metals that are needed for decarbonising the global economy, but secondly to play our part in reducing emissions and maximising renewable energy sources.
Industry excursions into development can sometimes be controversial. For example, corporate social responsibility can be seen as opportunistic and sometimes public relations driven. Yet many are demanding that the industry take a more active role in development. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals. What should be the role of industry in supporting development?
Many of our members would no longer think of it in terms of CSR. They would be thinking more in terms of partnership, working jointly with communities and local, regional and national governments to develop a shared vision about how to maximise the positive impacts of their operations. I think the SDGs provide a wonderful opportunity to help align everyone around that. We've got 17 goals which have been clearly articulated, and it's a chance for companies to articulate how they'll achieve them, and for governments also to align and help companies align with their own objectives.
You talk about meeting the expectations of communities. What is the business case for companies to become involved?
I think that's very clear. I think it's social license to operate. Our members think of themselves as wanting to be the development partner of choice. They want to, when they come into a new area, they want to have a reputation of having done things right by previous communities, and of course in their existing operations they want to maintain harmony and peace with the surrounding communities. So in order to do that, they need to develop and maintain the social license to operate, and that's easily said, hard to do in some cases because it can be very complicated issue determining priorities and engaging with many different parts of a surrounding community.
Does community have a voice in the company that invests?
I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been sufficient voice in the past, and perhaps that's something that needs to be explored further. I think that has evolved though, largely because of the internet. These days, if you go to Peru, people are very well aware of what happened in Mongolia the previous week, especially if it's the same mining company that they're engaging with in Peru. And so, whilst 10 years ago one might have assumed that a community would be not very aware of what was going on elsewhere in the world, there's a lot more benchmarking and understanding of these kind of global issues. So increasingly there's a voice from local communities.
And to what extent have your member companies developed the expertise to be able to play this active role in development?
I think it varies from member to member. Some of them are further up the curve than others, and also it depends on the types of countries where they've been working, whether they're in developed countries or developing, and also whether they're in very remote areas or areas where there are significant communities on the ground. But it's very much in their mind one of the top priorities for our member CEOs is community acceptance, and they're all grappling with how to achieve that.
Perhaps we can review progress by key stakeholder groups. So where they were 15 years ago and where they are today. Let's start with the industry. To what extent do you see significant differences in performance between your member companies and the sector at large?
Clearly, one big issue is artisanal mining. So a lot of people, when you say the word mining, who don't know very much about it, the first thing that comes to mind is artisanal mining. So the fact that as a planet we haven't managed to properly regulate artisanal mining, I think drags down the name of the industry as a whole. And then inevitably there are some smaller companies who are less sophisticated in their approach to how they approach communities, who are perhaps still stuck in the CSR philanthropy approach without thinking very deeply about long-term presence in a project and social license to operate, and sometimes those kind of behaviours backfire as well. It's always down to governments to regulate, whether it's to regulate large companies or to regulate artisanal mining. In the case of my members, who by and large are global companies operating in many countries, they have taken the approach that because in some countries the legislation may not be best practice, that they will essentially self-regulate at the global level to the same standard, irrespective of where they're operating. The issue with artisanal mining is that in many countries, because there isn't sufficient capacity in the host country, the regulation is very weak. And so you see issues like environmental contamination, pollution, mercury in the water, and cyanide being used indiscriminately that are not being addressed at all. And of course human rights issues like child labour, using very young children, sometimes down to as young as 4 or 5 in these operations, which of course should be regulated as well by the host country.
So talking about the role of the host country, thinking 15 years ago and today, mining is inherently a cyclical industry. To what extent are governments better coping with that cyclicality at the moment?
I think there have been some good examples, not just from the developing world, but also the developed world, of how the cycle wasn't handled very well. People are looking at Western Australia, for example, who didn't really set aside for a rainy day during the last boom, and I think they're seeing some of the consequences now. I think in general, during the boom, there was a missed opportunity to use some of the projects that were being developed to develop infrastructure, and in particular to encourage companies to share infrastructure. Hopefully in the next cycle we'll see people thinking a little bit more carefully about that, and of course governments have to play a role because they set the framework for sharing infrastructure, but companies can also think about how they could be more collaborative. And we're seeing some examples. So for example in Chile, several companies are now teaming up on projects, collaborating on projects which previously they were trying to develop on a go-it-alone basis.
Why that change? Why are companies more prepared to collaborate today than in the past?
Partly cost pressure, but also has to do with sustainability. I think, for example, we've seen a case with two of our members, Goldcorp and Tech in Chile, who've combined forces on two separate projects, which originally they were going to develop in parallel. They're now going to develop sequentially. That means they'll need less infrastructure jointly, and the project life will be twice as long, which I think is in the interests of the local communities as well. So it was partly driven by the cost pressures as the copper price came down, but also made more sense from the point of view of license to operate.
Industry and civil society appear to some extent to have competing agendas. To what extent can these differences be reconciled?
I don't think the differences are as big as they seem. I think if you accept that we're going to move the hundreds of millions of poor people in India and China into the middle classes and also help decarbonise to address climate change, then you accept that there's a need for metals and minerals. And then it comes down to agreeing a common vision at the local level in the host countries that have the resources on how we're going to maximise the positive impacts and minimise the negative impacts.
So while the agenda may not be as far apart as some would lead to believe, in order to construct a vision there's going to need to be a common vocabulary, and to some extent companies talk about the positives that they can deliver while civil society focuses on the negatives.
I agree, and I think part of what ICMM does is to help establish that common vocabulary, and one of the most important parts of our strategy relates to partnership and engaging with all stakeholders on this dialogue and this debate to generate a common understanding.
Arguably, many resource nations missed opportunities offered by the last commodities boom. Who bears the blame?
I think there's accountability on all sides. I think companies have some accountability, but it's first and foremost up to host country governments to set the terms on which their natural resources will be developed. There was a great example in one African country where at one point during the boom 5 separate companies were advocating 5 separate railways to help get their product to market. And everyone from outside the country could see that they would be lucky to get 1 railway off the ground, let alone 5. So the government could have set the terms for that discussion and obliged the companies to collaborate. And equally, I think the companies could have played a better role in helping to collaborate on shared infrastructure and not promote something that was unrealistic.
What about the role of multilateral agencies in supporting governments?
I think they have a key role to play as well. Obviously, they are only welcome in the host country if the host country is willing to accept their advice and invite them in. But they have a huge amount of expertise. In particular, my former employer, the World Bank Group, has a lot of policy expertise on these kind of issues.
Tom, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
And to keep up with the latest debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.